Merci. So hello everyone, welcome to the CSH seminar, the last one of the academic year 2022-23. I am Joël Caballon, researcher here at the CSH and in charge of the seminar with Laurence Gauthier. Just a quick announcement, as I said, this is the last seminar of the season, but you can already write down that we will resume on the 4th of September with our first guest speaker for the new academic year, that will be Ashish Kothari. Regarding the seminar that was cancelled last month of Dr. Odile Henry, it will be replaced next year, and we will obviously announce that later once we figure out a date. So today we are very happy to welcome Surinder Jodhka and Vamsi Vakulabharanam for a joint presentation on a very promising topic, mapping wealth and the wealthy in India, a research which results from a collective project that recently ended and started delivering some results. So we'll come back to the word results. I think you were just not appropriating it.
Thank you very much, Joel and Odile CSH, for asking us to be part of this very important seminar. And this is also CSH study. So we are very happy to, I think first public presentation is here. We have presented only to the program team so far. This is our first presentation, and I'm very happy that all of us are here. Vamsi is here and Divya has agreed to be discussant. So thank you so much. Let me start by making some formal acknowledgements. That's very, very critical. First slide. Yeah. So this is part of Wealth Inequality and Elite in Global Study, which is project funded by Southern Center for Inequality Studies in University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. And Arup Chatterjee is the overall coordinator of this project. So we are grateful to them for having funded the project and kind of asking us to do the project. This is housed in CSH. So we are grateful to Odile and Amit has been very helpful. We would also like to acknowledge our team members, and their names are written here. We will tell you about the 4 teams that the study was carried out in 4 different city regions of India. That is Mumbai, which was done by Shripad Motiram. Hyderabad was done by Prindra Prasad. Calcutta was done by Manas Bhaumik, Saswat Guha and Riona Basu. And Delhi was done by Ishan Anand and Anjana Thampi. Ishan has, I think, already spoken here earlier. So this is, as the title suggests, is a very ambitious kind of project. And we were contacted, we had a workshop in South Africa before pandemic. And by the time funding came and we actually started talking about the project, we had shifted online. And then it was kind of, just visualizing a study like this, which was primarily going to be an empirical study, was very difficult because pandemic produced so many uncertainties. But we thought that we will try, and they were a little more flexible than they would usually be. So there was some extra time, but the field work for the project was done in 2021-22. We put up our teams together and we started kind of working on it. Now, talking about wealth is not something which is new. We have been talking about wealth for quite some time, and we'll come to that in a sense in a minute. But I think this context is very critical to pose, that if you look at the pandemic effect, this data produced by Pew in New York. India has been one of the countries where 60% of the increase that we had in global poverty was located here. 75 million individuals, in some sense, fell in poverty in India, which was kind of largest anywhere, which makes for 60% of the total global poor, which kind of, people who were added to the poverty line. Likewise, Indian middle class also shrank by 32 million. These are estimates, and I'm not the data person. Vamsi can explain if you have any questions. He has also seen that piece. And this, again, makes for 60% of the global retreat. And this is a piece available online. If you just enter Rakesh Kochar, PEW, you will find it's not EPW, by the way, it's PEW, right? You should not confuse. And if you look at the number of billionaires, and this is something which is not only an Indian trend, but in India, number of people who have huge amount of wealth, their number has been consistently increasing. And this, in some sense, is very clearly evident from this table. If you look at this data, this is from Hurun list. And in some sense, every year, single year from 2012 to 2022, India has seen number of individuals who are listed number of individuals with 1,000 crores. And just now we were talking about that, this number is only 1,103, which makes India with top 5 countries of billionaires. Number of dollar billionaires also is 221, 237. But if you look at the number of 1,000 crore plus, the actual number could be 10 times more than that, or even maybe 50 times more than that, or even 100 times more than that. We don't really know, but our gut feeling suggests that these many perhaps would be in the city of Delhi itself. So wealth is in India, everywhere it is hidden, but in India it's much more in some sense hidden or hard to access. Wealth becomes a subject. People begin to talk about big wealth as something which needs to be talked about in the 1990s. Inequality studies obviously has been much older. Poverty study has been much older. So the other end of kind of inequality was generally not really quantified. So and as I just said, India has seen significant expansion in private wealth in the 1990s. And I think more importantly, something which kind of brings me in as a sociologist, because wealth is some subject which people like Vamsi and Himanshu work on. But also, I think culturally, there has been kind of mainstreaming of wealth. It was again, in 2000s that you have this new fashion starting almost, where there are different magazines which start preparing lists of wealthy. So being wealthy used to be, in some sense, not seen as something that one would celebrate. People used to hide their wealth, or they would not project themselves to be wealthy. But in the post-1990s period, neoliberal kind of thing, and then after the 21st century, being wealthy also becomes trendy, right? It's not something that, so wealth is a positive signifier. But most of the, in some sense, popular explanation for this is that these are people who are either from wealthy families, and they have kind of become the new leaders of society, which produce employment, which produce wealth. Wealth means economy. Wealth means kind of riches of that country, and it is in positive sense. And another narrative that becomes much more significant during this period is this whole question about self-making. That these are individuals, they are entrepreneurial, and they are very smart and very clever, and they have the ability to somehow put together various things, and they are self-made, and they are not really people who have any kind of family, what one should say, privilege, but they are able to kind of become in some sense rich. And so much so that even the caste question was framed in this framework. The Dalit should try to be giver of employment, a new kind of Dalit capital, Dalit entrepreneurship, same kind of mode that you need to kind of make yourself. We will support you, but entrepreneurship is everywhere, and Dalits can also become millionaires and can provide jobs. There's also a kind of connection with nationalism and national narrative, that this India has millionaires or billionaires, which again, in terms of economic processes, this is the mainstream narrative. So we, in some sense, try to frame the question of wealth slightly differently, that wealth could also be a useful kind of prism or lens or perspective to look at society, not only just economy, not only just money and assets. So it's not simply a kind of question of accumulating economic good, that would be the formal definition of wealth, but also wealth is a relational process. Because it is an indicator of wider social structure, history, and political process in which we are living. So if there is a large, big wealth, construction of big wealth, that obviously implies many other things. It also helps us also kind of then thinking of Indian social life from a different perspective by giving primacy to materialities of social hierarchies. So wealth is not something which is new to India. Wealth has always existed, as Vamsi will elaborate in the historical aspect. And in this kind of, if wealth is the lens, then one would also think of upper, not simply in ritual terms, which in some sense has become very popular globally. The moment you talk about caste, you only think about the ritual hierarchies, and the ritual hierarchies then would in some sense erase wealth. That, wealth doesn't really matter in India. What matters is your karma and what you do for the next life, and hierarchies are all determined by your ritual status. In some sense, the wealth lens opens up to a new kind of imagination of Indian social structure, which gives privacies to these materialities. So it also helps us to kind of raise questions of mobility, and mobilities are happening across different social groups, or if it is not happening, that also then your focus moves from simple processes like Sanskritization and untouchability to also questions of who is going down, who is going up. And those kinds of questions are studied only in the recent present context. If you go to the medieval times, or 15th century, 16th century, 4th century, I think lots of things were happening. There were population movements, and we have lots of historical literature which shows how migrations were producing new kinds of urban processes in 16th, 17th century, David Ludden's work. So all those also become relevant questions. And then, as we will explain in a short while, the moment you talk about wealth, these are regional processes, regional economies, and wealth is located within community dynamics. It's not simply an independent economic process. It also, in some sense, helps us reimagine question of kinship and marriage, because that's how wealth reproduction happens. So in the way we kind of continue in framing wealth, we kind of thought about not just looking straight away at wealth, for which you have some kind of listings available, but thinking of wealth as a temporal process. As I just said, history is very, very critical. So there are moments of expansion, shrinkage, and reproduction. So I think these were the broad three kind of questions around which we wove our projects. And there are kind of also significant spatial processes. Spatial processes give us an idea about thinking about this South Asian region beyond a singular view of nation state. So nation state is not the best site for thinking about India's economies or wealth processes. So the best way to think about wealth processes is to enter regions through cities. And this again is a very important point, because the moment you think about India in 1940s, 50s, when anthropologists began to study India, they said village is the methodological entry point to the study of Indian society. You study a village, you study India. Against that perspective, we are arguing that if we were to make wealth as lens, we have to look at regional economies, and the best methodological entry point for studying regional economies are the cities, because historically cities have existed in India for as long as perhaps rural settlements have existed, and regional formations, regional economies, regional political economies, political formations were always around a city. So I think city becomes the center for regional political economy, and city becomes also centers where wealth is accumulated, wealth is in some sense stored and lived as a relational process. So city is very important site for power, for elite processes, and which includes a site where you will locate wealth and wealthy historically. Interestingly, more recent literature is again showing it that if you look at caste-based identities in the present, it's not in the village that they are consolidated and reproduced. Their articulation, mobilization actually happens at the regional level, and city becomes the center where caste-based identities are consolidated through caste associations, and also in terms of when we are talking about wealth and economy, and caste is a very important resource through which reproduction happens. We'll show it through our study. Diversities of India is very well known in terms of states and regions, ecological diversities. We don't want to go into that, but there is very important point about caste and communities, because that's a very central point in our study, that we think of Indian caste system, but on ground you have different kinds of caste formations, and those caste formations are very closely related with regional histories and the kind of communitarian dynamics you have in each region. So for example, when we are talking about Kammas and Reddys, automatically we are talking about Telangana and the Andhra Pradesh. We will not talk about Gujarat when we are talking about Kammas and Reddys. So Patels are not there in Bengal or in Odisha. And this is very important. If you have to look at the biographies of wealth, history of wealth, and if we look at wealth as kind of in relation to these social and historical processes, then it is very important to identify regions along with communities And these communities their dynamics are kind of region specific. And as we know, even in last 75 years after independence, trajectories of economic growth have been very different, and they are region specific. And this is not something that the audience here doesn't know. So broadly speaking, we had three objectives for this study. First was to look at history and contemporary socioeconomic cultural processes through which wealth elites have been created. And the second question is to try to empirically map a wealth elite or wealthy people, which is very, very difficult, and it's not impossible. And I think it's a good starting point. These are kind of things that we are talking about. That's why we talked about challenges and possibilities. And so it's not difficult to do that. And some of those things we were discussing, just if you have to look at settlements, and in Delhi, if you can identify a house, if it sells for 100 crores or 90 crores, that means the person who owns that house is already belongs to big wealth, whether the person owns 1,000 crores or 5,000 crores or 500 crores, but definitely he's already big wealthy, or she's already owner of big wealth. So dynamics of social ascription in the process of wealth expansion, shrinkage, and reproduction, this is something that we'll come back to later. But whenever we talk about wealth, we talk about wealth only in terms of dollars or kind of properties or cash. But we are saying that wealth also should be seen as an ascription process. This we started with, and this has turned out to be a very important kind of point. So as I said, we have four city regions. They are not cities, but we look at them as city regions. For example, Bombay, Mumbai is not simply Bombay or city. Bombay, Mumbai historically has also been a kind of wealth region or economic region in many senses of the term, which includes Gujarat and Gujarat, Maharashtra. If anybody knows the history, they would likewise. Hyderabad is not simply a city. Hyderabad is very closely connected with the wealth processes of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, how rich from Andhra region, present-day Andhra Pradesh, moved to Hyderabad, and then Hyderabad becomes Hyderabad. So it's also becoming of Hyderabad in 1990s, post-1990s, is also a regional wealth process. Likewise, Calcutta, which was at one time capital of India, and it has its own very peculiar history of wealth, where you mostly have outsiders, in double quotes, being the wealthy. And NCR is still an emerging region. It's very hard to kind of visualize NCR as a wealth region. So it's been difficult for us, but something that we can work on. City of Delhi has its own identity, but if you have to look at NCR, it's much harder. Other three regions were easier to kind of operationalize. So how do we go about it? We decided by thinking of India's wealth culture, cultures of accumulation, big wealth, small wealth. We made this distinction between big wealth and small wealth. And this again comes back to a question of lens. Wealth has been a very, very important cultural process of India, even though Orientalist writings would tell us that we are otherworldly, or Weber would tell us we are otherworldly. But wealth accumulation, even at a micro level, even a poorest of the poor household will have some piece of gold or silver. Weddings is a time when, giving some kind of dowry through families. So some amount of accumulation of wealth becomes very, very critical for individuals to think of themselves in this world. So there are wealth cultures in India, which nobody talks about, right? So there is small wealth, which in some sense creates legitimacy for accumulation of big wealth. This is again a very interesting, important question, and we need to kind of still work on it. What do we mean by wealth cultures? Wealth cultures basically meaning that there is positive value attached to some kind of accumulation in terms of fixed assets. It could be buying property, but most importantly, gold. The amount of gold that you have in India, I think perhaps is largest in the world. The amount of gold that India imports today, it's because of this cultural reason, not because of wealth reason, but that has connection with producing a kind of legitimacy for big wealth. And this again is kind of opening up a new question for research. And there is kind of invisibility and conspicuousness of wealth simultaneously. Historically speaking, we know that all the Rajas and rich people had huge kind of, building of Taj Mahal was a sign of conspicuous consumption. If you see the images of Maharajas, they're always wearing jewelries all over their bodies. So there is, on the one hand, culture of conspicuous consumption, of exhibiting wealth as really you're embodying wealth. But at the same time, there are also these Baniya communities, Marwadi communities, which have very strong culture of invisibilizing wealth. They would look like very poor people, and then they have huge amount of wealth that they're sitting on. And this is again something on which there's very little research done. and informality of contemporary Indian economy, which also makes it difficult to trust text data. Most of the wealth research globally that is being done by economists is around the text data, which in some senses is of no value in India. It would only be fraction 5% of the actual wealth that exists. So wealth is understated. Just finally, research process. We started by kind of, had several meetings with, we have these 4 teams, and we kind of continued meeting them. So we thought that it is possible to kind of begin with making lists of wealthy people. So one, lists are available, and you can take those lists for your city, your region, and then talk to people around you. It's very easy. You talk to 2 journalists who work on, local gossips about wealthy in that city, in that region. They will give you a list. And if you work for 2 weeks with 20 people, you would have a kind of operational list with which you can start thinking about. And we also did not think of just 1,000 crore as a category, which Hurun list does. We thought that there could be possibly 3 different ways of thinking of big wealth. Big wealth, those who are owner of 1,000 crore plus, those who are owner of less than 1,000 crores, but more than 100 crores. And there is also a fuzzy category, say, for example, new entrants in the wealth. You have to find out people are entering, somebody who is a kind of Dalit entrepreneur, and even if has 20 crores, that is big wealth, and that has potential to grow up. So we thought that we could include that as well. So the listing was done at the local level using local sources, formally, informally. Second stage, we tried to do some kind of surveys. It's very difficult to survey wealthy people because no one is going to give you appointment. We were also working during pandemic, and we also had limited time and limited resources, and this is not something, but we thought that we could visualize a survey, but actually that survey could be from wherever you can get data from online. You can get some data, LinkedIn net accounts, you can get some data from local newspaper gossips, or you can get biographies. So whatever resource you have available, if you can get appointments, good, but that kind of we were very practical, that would not happen so easily. But survey, just you have a schedule, and schedule has certain items, try to fill in those kinds of variables. And then you can do case studies through a little more intensive research on those individuals, and all of them would have Wikipedia items. Some of them have written biographies, but there are also many who are just kind of new entrants, but there would be stories about them. In the local context, anyone who becomes wealthy, people talk about it, and it's not impossible to access that. You just need to have time. And then we also looked at history. So now Vamsi can move on. You can go to the other presentation.
Thanks, Surinder, for framing the entire project, and thanks to CSH, Odile, and Joel, and Amit was with us, throughout the project. So what I'll do, just following from Surinder's framing of the project, I'll basically present some of the findings, from not just this study, but also to give you a basic foundation of what exists in the previous surveys, wealth surveys in India. So I'll start with that, and then, we'll also come to the findings from the current study. So just to give you some motivation, from the standpoint of economics, so there's been a renewed interest in wealth studies, even in economics across the world. Since the 1980s and 1990s, this is partly because there's been a huge concentration of wealth after 1980s under, what has come to be known as neoliberal capitalism. And most of these studies show a U-shaped evolution of both income shares of the top 1%. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the concentration was very high. And in the middle decades of the 20th century, the concentration went down significantly, and then it rose quite sharply after 1980. So that is the story that many of these studies capture. And the empirical literature, to begin with, was mainly in the developed countries, as you would expect. They collect data on income and consumption and wealth. But even developed nations, they don't capture the top 1% of the population. I think the work of Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez, starting in the 90s, I think they did some really fascinating empirical work. And they also picked up data from estates, tax data, sources that were not tapped until that point in time, just to supplement the existing sources, for instance, the surveys, which, even in the developed countries, US, for instance, wealth surveys don't capture the top 1% very well. So you have to do extra work in order to do that. And that's what we end up doing in this study to some extent. And then, of course, you have all these lists, the Forbes list, Credit Suisse, and Oxfam reports. These are things that we are now familiar with at this point in time, but these started, earnestly in the 90s and 2000s. In India, wealth-related issues were relatively underexplored until almost 2005, 15 years into market reforms. And I just gave you some references. Jairaj and Subramanian at MIDS, Madras Institute of Development Studies. Then we followed after that, some of us, Arjun Jayadev, Sripad Motiram, then Ishan Anand and Anjana Thampi, who are part of this project. And so we've been publishing a few papers on wealth inequality in India. I'll show you the strengths and limitations of that work. And then, of course, you have these, ultra net worth individual lists from Hurun or Forbes in more recent times, right? That Surinder already pointed to. You cannot see the title there, but that is All India Debt and Investment Survey, AIDIS. That's the main wealth survey in India. It's been conducted mainly in rural areas until 1980s. Starting in 1990s, this survey extended to urban spaces, and the data was available in electronic form. So you could do a lot of interesting analysis. The methodology adopted in the survey is very similar to other national sample survey data. It's less frequent typically than consumption and employment. By the way, all of this works until 2011 or so. After that, after 2014 especially, government stopped releasing any kind of data. So they did release a wealth survey in 2018, but it's deeply flawed. So I'm not going to really draw from it. It completely messes up the sampling. It tries to produce very positive results. It's just not believable, the 2018 wealth survey. But returning to the survey itself, it does comprehensively capture wealth categories, types and values of assets, liabilities, demographic characteristics. It even had occupational categories using which you could talk about class. It has caste categories. The main limitation is that there is very low or no representation of the ultra wealthy groups. So what it means is there's a significant underestimation of wealth inequality. That's the problem with this survey. But you get the bottom, 95%, right? But the top 5% is what we are, typically interested in wealth studies. That's great. Yeah. So this slide, I'm just, talking about my previous always collaborative research on wealth inequality. So, for the period between 91 and 2002, I did collaborative work with Arjun Jayadev and Sripad Motiram. Then with Sripad, I also did work on urban wealth and overall national wealth inequality for the first 2 decades after market reforms. I also looked at caste and wealth inequality with Ajit Zacharias, who works in the US, Levy Institute. And then we also did a fascinating set of comparisons of wealth inequality between China and India. China was one of the most equal countries in the late 70s, and its wealth inequality is now comparable to Indian wealth inequality, or it's definitely probably higher now. So those are the kinds of previous studies. And what are the main findings, from the survey itself? So one thing that we found in all these papers is wealth inequality is quite significant in India, and it rose quite sharply between 2002 and 2012. The net wealth Gini, so Gini coefficient, for those of you who are not familiar, it's a coefficient that varies from 0 to 1. 0 is complete equality, 1 is complete inequality, meaning one person would own all the wealth. Most countries in the world would fall somewhere between 0.3 and 0.9. In wealth terms, typically it's 0.5 to 0.95. Just to give you an extreme example, South Africa, although they have come out of apartheid, without including the top 1%, their wealth Gini is 0.96. It's one of the highest in the world. And most Latin American countries are extremely unequal. The US is around 0.8. India, it was 0.65 in 1991 at the onset of market reforms, and it sharply rose to 0.74 by 2012, and without including the top 1%. And when Gini coefficient moves by 20%, in 20 years, an earthquake is happening in the country. It's a very sluggish coefficient. It doesn't move very quickly. When Gini coefficient increases by 20%, something very big is happening, and that's captured by the survey. In terms of caste groups, religious groups, there's extremely low ownership of assets among Dalits, STs, and Muslims, scheduled tribes and Muslims. So this is something that comes through even in this survey. The main assets in India are land and buildings, which constitute about 90% of all assets in the country. More recently, financial assets are beginning to show up in the surveys, but they're not very significant. The main manifestations of this rising inequality between 91 and 2012 is rising within urban inequality. I'll show you a couple of slides with the data, and rising urban-rural gap. So urban is just, racing ahead of rural. And there are two fascinating processes, urbanization of both wealth concentration, but also urbanization of extreme wealth deprivation, right? Both have shifted to the urban. So extreme wealth deprivation is also in the urban. Let me show you those slides using the data. This is just to give you a decomposition of the wealth inequality between 2002 and 2012. So the overall wealth inequality is, you see that, next to overall Gini 0.65 to 0.75. That's the jump between 2002 and 2012. The within rural inequality is, it was 98.1% in 2002. That accounted for 98% in 2002. And it decreases to 95.5%. So which means, the rural-urban gap is beginning to show in the surveys. That is something that's rising. But if you go further down and look at the urban part, so urban contribution to the overall, within urban inequality, contribution to the overall inequality, in 2002 was 40.1%. And that sharply increases in 10 years to 57.7%. So urban accounts for, within urban inequality accounts for 57.7% of the total within inequality, within urban, within rural. And it accounts for 55% of the entire inequality in wealth terms. So urban is really driving this process. And this also, therefore, fits with our, methodological entry point, which is cities, not, the rural. This is, you split the entire population of India into 10 deciles. 1 is the bottom decile and 10 is the top decile. If you look at the bottom decile, this is the point of, extreme wealth deprivation. In 2002, 66.2% of the bottom decile came from the rural. In 2012, it has gone down to 45.3%. In 2002, urban constituted 33.8% of the bottom decile. Now it is 54.7%. So urbanization of poverty, urbanization of extreme poverty in wealth terms, right? That's what it shows. Now let's switch to the top decile. Top decile had 57% from rural areas earlier and 43% from urban areas. By 2012, you actually see, urban has 58% of the top decile and 43% come from rural, right? So there's a flip, that occurs during this period in 10 years, right? I mean, maybe the surveys capture a longer process because it's an accumulation process. It has a lagged effect, but this is what happens by 2012. And in caste terms, again, what do the surveys tell us? Wealth holdings, the wealth hierarchy is very much along expected lines. So if people are arguing that, Indian caste hierarchies have changed, they haven't changed in wealth terms at all. Other castes or so-called upper castes, they have much higher, average assets compared to OBC castes, and they are much higher than Dalits and STs, and Muslims are at the bottom. In terms of asset ownership, Muslims are at the bottom in urban spaces, also in rural spaces. So that is something that's evident. In terms of people, for people, I'm sure there's a lot of sociologists in the audience who are interested in stratification processes. So there are techniques you could use to look at stratification processes in the among these individuals or households. There's a very clear stratification of the so-called upper caste from the data, right, compared to the rest of the groups. And all the other groups, there's a lot of overlap, from they overlap with one another, but upper castes are cut above the entire population. So that also comes through through the surveys. And wealth inequality across all these caste groups worsened. So meaning, the position of Dalits and Muslims, their wealth share declined after liberalization, right? So that is also something that's evident. There are lots of debates, in the 90s. I remember even somebody who was deeply inspirational for me, somebody like Gail Omved. She's the reason why I came to social sciences. I was an engineer. I had a long, argument with Gail Omved about, liberalization and how it may affect Dalits. And she was of the position that, market reforms would help Dalits. And we disagreed that day. And, when I look at the 2012 data, I feel somewhat vindicated. Not that, I think her insights are absolutely brilliant. But I think there was some expectation that, market reforms would alter, the space. They haven't. That is the key point. Okay, so now we come to the current study. What is the motivation for the current study? As I already mentioned, top wealth is not captured in all these findings that I have presented so far. Now there are wealth lists, for instance, what Surinder pointed out, the Hurun list. But the concrete historical, spatio-temporal, sociological, or political economy processes are not captured in these wealth lists. We don't know. I mean, we know who are the individuals, but what are the processes, causal processes, what are the sociological or political economic processes, that drive wealth accumulation? That is something you cannot figure out. There is a history in India, academic history of writing business histories, but a lot of that is hagiography, not very useful for scholarly work. But where it is not hagiography also, some of these processes are not captured the way, social scientists would, focus and capture some of these. So that is part of the motivation. The other part was, bringing economy and society together. So I was excited to work with Surinder, bringing social processes and political economic processes. That's a rare kind of collaboration. Rarely do economists and sociologists talk to each other. And when they talk, usually conversations break down. And we never had a single breakdown in our conversations, so I'm happy to report that. All right, so looking at, just giving you a visual picture, most of you know where these city regions are located. New Delhi, where we are currently, located, and then Bombay, Mumbai, which captures, it's the catchment for Gujarat and Maharashtra. Hyderabad is a catchment for, the erstwhile Hyderabad state, which includes some parts of Karnataka and Maharashtra as well, but Telangana and Andhra Pradesh after the linguistic reorganization. And then Kolkata, which is a catchment for the eastern region broadly, and I'll have some comments to make on that. So how do we map the wealthy? So we used Hurun list, but we also expanded that list, as Surinder already pointed to. So Hurun list captures people who are above 120 million US dollars or 1,000 crores. So those are the numbers for these 4 cities, 118 in Hyderabad and so on until 2007 for all India. We didn't include Bangalore and Chennai, which have a significant chunk of the wealthy. And then we also incorporated, people who are above 100 crores, up to 1,000 crores. How did we get this data? We use things like Panama Papers, Provis data sets, Fundu, and a number of other secondary data sources. So researchers went into the field. They talked to various individuals, and then tried to get some quantitative estimates of the wealth holdings that these people had. And then we have a fuzzy category, which is basically we don't know how much wealth they have. We cannot give a quantitative estimate, but we know that they're very wealthy, right? So this is part of the invisible wealth. We know that they've accumulated quite a lot, but we don't know how much exactly. So we put that in the fuzzy category. And then we did these primary surveys of roughly 80 individuals from each of these city regions. And we also did case studies of around 10 people from each city region. So that is the entire data that we collected, right? So, from the Hurun list itself, this is the sectoral distribution of the very wealthy. So all usual suspects: software, chemicals, pharma, real estate, finance and investments. But there is a residual category of other. We don't know what it is. It just says other. Yeah, multiple other categories. Everything else is pooled under that. So, but these are usual suspects. The ones that I listed. Yeah. It could be multiple. Yeah. Okay, so what is the temporal story of wealth that emerges from our study, this particular study? So we also, requested the teams to work on, pre-independence histories as well as post-independence period. So pre-independence, there is a pre-British period and there is the British period. So pre-British period, you had the traditional business communities, and Indians, these business people, they were probably among the wealthiest in the world at that point in time. So just to give you an example, Jagat Seth, from Bengal region, Murshidabad, or Virji Vora from Surat, right, Gujarat, or Avachi Tippayasetti, from Guntur region, is a Komati. These are people, who probably ranked among the wealthiest people in the whole world, and they acquired their wealth through either, trade or money lending, right? These were the two main operations they had. And of course, apart from these traditional business communities, you also had ruling political elites, and they acquired a lot of wealth. And as Surinder was saying, their practice was to also be conspicuous. They were not wealth accumulators, but they had a lot of wealth. They possessed a lot of wealth. In the early British period, what you see is there's a decline. This is across all these 4 city regions. These are generalizations that I'm presenting. There's a decline in the Indian political elites, especially in the directly ruled British Dominion in the early British period. And there's also, Professor Utsa Patnaik of, former professor at JNU. Her estimates show that, $45 trillion were drained out of India. So a lot of wealth was taken out of India during this period. This is what we know as wealth drain or colonial plunder. But nevertheless, right, even with that wealth drain, certain business communities realigned with the British state, the colonial state, and they accumulated a lot of wealth, like Parsis, for instance, right, who participated in the opium trade during the early British period. And they are key to understand the emergence and consolidation of Bombay, for instance, the city of Bombay, or Gujarati Baniyas and Marwadis. If you come to the south, we didn't look at Chennai. The Chettiar community probably emerged and became very wealthy in the late 19th century, late British period. And even during this period, princely rulers, they continued to flourish. They didn't lose their So these are the territories that the British did not directly rule, and they continued to flourish into independent India. I'll come to that in a second. The late British period, manufacturing was added to trade and money lending. I think some of the wealthy, people went into manufacturing, for instance, textiles. This is, basically following the British rule. Now it was no longer handloom textiles, for which India was very famous, calicos or muslins, but this is now mill-produced cloth, right? By the late 19th century, various textile factories were opened in Bombay or Kanpur or Coimbatore, it's spread across the country, or Kolkata, jute mills. And the wealthy had a very collaborative relationship with the state throughout, this entire period. All these periods, wealthy have been working very closely with the state, whether it is pre-colonial, whether it's British state, whether it is post-British Indian state. And that is an important point to, keep in mind. The princely rulers, they still flourished. Just to give you a remarkable example, in the 1930s, Hyderabad, the Nizam of Hyderabad, he was considered the wealthiest person in the entire world, right? So this is, in 1948, of course, there's a revolution and, both from the communists and then the Indian state takes over Telangana. So the Nizam flees. But until that point, he was considered the wealthiest person in the 30s and 40s. Continuing with the temporal story, post-independence, you had, the first regime, which is an autarkic regime, 1947 to 1980s. Basically, this was a closed kind of economy. Indian state was trying to implement what are known as import substitution industrialization policies, with support to a fledgling private sector, which couldn't operate the entire economy on its own. So, people probably know here about the Mumbai plan. They made the plan and they wanted the state to intervene and help, right? So that is something that was done. But there was also a lot of public sector creation during that period. State gave a lot of patronage to both private capitalist classes, but also dominant farmers. This is something that, rich farmers, we can talk about it in detail. But one thing that led to the concentration of wealth is progressive taxation in wealth terms, and especially estate taxes, right? Inheritance tax or estate tax was very important. If you go back to the 50s or 60s and look at the top 10 wealthy people, out of 10, you will see 8 or 9 people from the erstwhile princely states. They were still extremely wealthy, and they lost their wealth through estate tax, to the extent that they have lost wealth. So the top political wealth declined through this taxation, but private agrarian capitalists improved their position, or rich farmers improved their position, and urban wealth that was in the hands of the private sector, that also grew. And the last period, which is the period of rapid wealth concentration, maybe that's the reason why we are all assembled here. We are still, several people have declared the end of neoliberal capitalism. It doesn't end. It goes on in one form or the other. So market processes, privatization, deregulation, accumulation through dispossession, or primitive accumulation, as Marx called it. Financial speculation is a process that gets added. Then, rapid service sector growth, the fire sector, finance, insurance, real estate, healthcare and education, they are extremely significant during this period. State patronage is still key. I think, when we are talking about, ultra net worth individuals, we are still, talking about how Ambani and Adani made their huge wealth, through state patronage. And this was also true of Dhirubhai Ambani, right, the father, through, manipulation of the state and so on. So this is also an interesting period when progressive wealth taxation is completely abandoned. So estate tax is abolished in 1985, and wealth tax, to whatever extent it worked, was abolished in 2015. So we don't have any wealth taxes at this point in time. There are capital gains taxes and things like that, but that's not a major revenue earner for the state. So to go back to the point Surinder was making, there is elite consolidation during this period. There is elite expansion and some attrition. So this is the temporal story. But we had 4 city regions. So what is the spatial story that emerges from this study? Around 1947, the traditional business communities, Banyas, Vaishyas, Parsis, and Marwadis, and Marwadi is a regional identity, of course. It has Agarwals, Jains, and so forth. And then you had the princely state rulers, as I said, Nizams or Sindhias, or, they were still extremely wealthy. So what you see in terms of one spatial similarity is the traditional business communities have flourished during this entire period, right, through independence, and they're still the wealthiest in India. These are the communities that are the top wealth in India still. They're predominantly Hindu, but you also see Jains and Parsis, right, who are part of this group. Mostly they are male. You see very few women, in these top lists. But they are also in some cases belong to the same families, wealthy families. Expansion. There's a significant expansion of elites after 1980s. There are 2 major groups that join the traditional business communities. One is professionals. So if you look at a city like Hyderabad, Anji Reddy, he was a professional. He worked in IDPL, a public sector firm, and then through ibuprofen, right? That was his miracle drug. He starts Reddy Labs and becomes one of the wealthiest people in Hyderabad. And there are Narayana Murthy or, Infosys, or Azim Premji. These are all professionals who became extremely wealthy. That is one route. And the second is agrarian wealth. I think, this is Harish Damodaran's work captures the second part very well, India's emerging capitalist classes. So agrarian or hinterland communities. So for instance, Hyderabad, saw an influx of agrarian wealth, which stopped in small towns or small cities to begin with in Andhra, like Vijayawada or Visakhapatnam, and then they jumped to Hyderabad. And there was nothing to stop them, and they flourished in Hyderabad. But if you look at Delhi, it's more the hinterland communities, as Surinder was saying, people from all around NCR who come into the NCR, to Delhi city, and then they begin to make their wealth. So even in terms of the wealth expansion, you mostly see the so-called Hindu upper caste or some middle caste, and a handful of others, as Surinder was saying, there are a few Dalit entrepreneurs, or, there are a few women entrepreneurs. We didn't come across, many Muslim entrepreneurs who did very well, who emerged during this period. So there is already that bias built into the system, and it's, of course, getting exacerbated now. And the third phenomenon is decline, and that is mainly Muslim. And apart from Muslim wealth that has declined, there's also some manufacturing sector elites. For instance, jute, entrepreneurs in Kolkata, they witnessed a significant decline after 1950s. Or cotton textiles, which shut down, for instance, Bombay 1980s. And also rulers of princely states, that is evident. They are nowhere in the top, 50 or top 100 in these lists, basically. So overall story, the spatial similarity story is you have layering and expansion of the wealthy and some selective destruction. So this is not, new wealth displacing the old. When England, saw the advent of capitalism, there was a completely new set of, agents that displaced the old wealth. That is not what is happening here. Here it is, layering and expansion of the wealth. It's a slightly subtle and different process. City spaces in particular also continue to be spatially layered and expansive for the big wealth. There's consolidation of the already wealthy localities, but there's also an expansion into peri-urban spaces. This is visible across the country in all these 4 city regions. And there's a displacement, accumulation through disposition, or market processes, through which, farming populations get displaced. Examples of those are Gachibowli, where University of Hyderabad is located, the new town in Kolkata, or Gurgaon or Gurugram in Delhi, and the Bandra Kundra complex in Bombay. These are just examples of that. And what are the spatial differences across the four cities? Partition of 1947, independence had differential impact on elites in different cities. For instance, the Muslim elite either fled Hyderabad after partition or it was destroyed. This is very different from other cities. So in effect, there was not a well-entrenched elite in Hyderabad when Andhra rich moved into Hyderabad. There were no barriers to entry. Cities like Hyderabad and Delhi largely witnessed the creation of new wealth, especially after 1960s and 70s. There's influx of agrarian and other hinterland communities, and from all over India for Delhi in particular. There's a general decline, this is also well known, of the eastern region of India after independence. It shows a relatively slower growth of wealth and the wealthy in a city like Kolkata. And political economic factors, this is something we can discuss. And the end of colonial rule, because Kolkata was a preeminent urban center during colonial rule. It was capital, but it continued to be a very important urban node. Once colonial rule ends, Kolkata's preeminence begins to decline. There's a slight reversal after 2000, emergence of places like Newtown and so forth. And then Mumbai and Kolkata witnessed significant reproduction of the old wealth, and so consolidation and some additions of professionals mainly in these two cities. We didn't see, a lot of agrarian wealth coming into Mumbai or Kolkata, unlike, Hyderabad in particular. So key takeaways from the spatial story, and I'll conclude. Wealth creation story across different city regions of the country. So regional and local histories, they do matter. Just to give you an example, direct British dominion versus princely states. I think wealth accumulation processes were very different. Ascriptive identities that Surinder referred to, they matter in the modern era. It's not that modernity eliminates these identities. Modernity in India builds on these identities, consolidates these, and cities. So elite consolidation in Mumbai and Kolkata and expansion in Hyderabad and Delhi. All these, can be. You have to think about caste and religion, and where there are barriers to elite expansion. Where economic elites already exist, new elites find barriers to entry. So, for instance, in Maharashtra, Bombay region, the Marathas, who did not have entry into Bombay, they expanded outside Bombay, right? In education, healthcare. That is the Sharad Pawar phenomenon, right? The party that he has. Exactly. And then, religious identity matters. Decline of the Muslim elites in Hyderabad and Delhi. So conclusions from the study, these findings. The first is, I'm repeating what I said. Indian wealth proceeds in a layered and expansive form. Old elite consolidation, this is traditional business communities. Elite expansion, urbanized agrarian elites and professionals. And then selective elite destruction, Muslims and princely states. Princely rulers, erstwhile princely rulers. And then spatio-temporal processes are key temporal similarities across regions, which I talked about at the beginning, mesh with the rich, distinctive spatial textures of different regions, producing very different stories, right, of wealth accumulation. In the post-independence period, 1947 to 85, one could say it's nationalization of some private wealth, for instance, banks or the estates owned by princely rulers. Rapid addition of nationalized wealth, which is the public sector creation, and protection of private sector wealth. I think Indian capitalists were very well protected in many ways during this period. The second period, post 1985, is significant privatization of national wealth, and also individual wealth, was captured, like accumulation through disposition processes. And then rapid private wealth accumulation after 1985. Beyond this, so this is the beginning, I think, of studies like these, and many more studies have to be done to unearth richer textured insights. So I'll hand it over to Surinder for other conclusions.
So if one was to kind of think of a broad sociological conclusion, there has been a kind of significant expansion of private health in terms of social background of people who are coming. So for example, if you look at the table that was there in the beginning, it's actually quite interesting to look at it. So if you look at the last column, self-made, in 2012, 62%, 55%, in 2022, 67%. That's quite kind of a lot. 67 out of 1,000 self-made. And if you look at the overall, it's kind of works out to be on around nearly, 1/3 to half of them are self-made. They are not this thing. But this is kind of, tricky. If you actually look at this closely, then you realize that this is kind of much more complicated. And yeah, so I'll come to that point later. So there is an expansion of wealth, both quantitatively as well as qualitatively, in the sense that there is this increase in number of people who own big wealth, nearly 11-fold increase in last 10 years, which is quite significant. And as we said, that actual wealth is perhaps, maybe 50 times more or whatever. We don't really know, but even in Delhi, you would have as many people with that much wealth, 1,000 crores, which is kind of national figure. Wealth accumulation and wealth inequalities are also qualitative processes, and therefore they need to be approached historically as relational and political processes, a point I think that has been already made by Vamsi many times. And this is something which is, So actually the social spread of wealth is so much that near 2/3 of them are actually new entrant. And that is what we call as the self-made. That is kind of overall data. We had processed it somewhere. But they are not in that sense new to the social hierarchy of that system. That point that Vamsi, if you actually look at in caste terms, they belong to the same social cohort, that is urban upper castes. So they're already there, and they kind of emerge as individuals in the big category, but they are already almost there. There are very few of them who actually come from Dalit or lower OBC background or even OBC background. So big wealth continues to be a site of exclusion in terms of caste, community, and regions. It's concentrated in certain regions, and it is not everywhere. For example, Hindi heartland is largely barren of big wealth. Hindi heartland would include starting from almost, UP, Eastern UP, particularly Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, which would be like nearly 70% of geographical region of India is largely barren of big wealth. And this is something which is very, very critical. Another important finding that comes out very, very, we were actually quite surprised when we looked at the whole data. All big wealth is urban. Right? Until very recently, people used to talk about, for example, Pranab Bardhan, when he talked about the ruling elite of India, he identified three classes, the capitalists, the professionals, and the feudal lords. That third class has simply melted away. It has not necessarily declined everywhere. I mean, the trajectory is very significantly. For example, in case of southern India, they have been able to move big wealth to the cities. Even the middle class has been able to come into cities, and those who were in some sense more aggressive, they were able to use political resources, their ethnic resources, in order to, in some sense, rise and get into new kind of industries, pharmaceuticals and stuff like that. And they have become kind of big wealth. Caste, community, and kinship continue to vary very, very significantly. And they are not merely surviving past traditions. And as I said, caste is a mobilized ascription process. It's not something that is kind of brought from past. These are also reimagined as new realities, and they are used as resources and buffers. What do I mean by buffers? Whenever there is crisis, whenever there is otherwise crisis of wealth, they will mobilize their community identities, and then it becomes, in some sense, politically possible for them to survive and expand. And there are many instances of that. So caste and community identities are used as resources and buffers by the wealth elite, and so-called self-made are nearly all of them from privileged social locations. So the broader theoretical implications is also requires us to think of elite as an ascription process. I don't think anybody has said this ever before like this. How does one think of elite as an ascription process? Elite is always seen as either in political terms or in wealth. Elite would be people, individuals who are wealthy, entrepreneurial, and we are kind of in some sense contesting that formulation or qualifying that population, that we also need to look at elite as an ascription process. So the quantitative kind of imagination of elite, which kind of thinks in terms of 1% or 0.01%, does not really reveal that reality about elite being a kind of social and political process, underlying social and political processes. Class is necessary but not sufficient for understanding processes of elite reproduction. There are strong boundaries, active exclusions, and their reproduction happens like reproduction of kinship. And I think these are points that need more elaboration, but we thought we can kind of try to put it here. So elite positions are rarely acquired through competition and merit unless there are other resources available. Not that there is no competition and there is no merit of some kind or the other, not that that is not required, not that you don't need to be hardworking and stuff like that, but that merely does not give you elite positions. You require other resources to be able to do that. So the question is not merely of reproduction, but also of representation. The moment we say elite is an ascription process, it also raises some other political and moral questions, that who are these people who are able to stay in that kind of elite processes, because this has implication for political systems and democracies, to their ability to survive. And this is something which is in some sense very easily visible in the political process. So as an ascription process, it helps us to raise questions of representation of caste, race, question of ethnicity, gender, location. And this is something that the mainstream Western political science does not allow us to do. So I think I'll stop here. If one has to kind of draw some big conclusions, some of these are here. But we also realize that this is just the beginning, and wealth is not an easy subject to study, but it is also a kind of, as we said, challenges and possibilities. There are many possibilities of kind of, now let's hear the judgment from the, maybe from here.
Okay, so thank you, Surinder and Vamsi, for this very rich discussion. Divya, the floor is yours for the discussion, and we'll proceed with the Q&A after that.
All right. So thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for inviting me to discuss this talk. I mean, there's a lot to say, and I particularly want to start by saying that when we think of wealth, we really think of issues of measurement. We think of definitional issues and those kinds of things, and absence of data that comes to mind. But what you've showed us is that there are possibilities of what one can do, given the kinds of data that is there, with whatever limitations might be there around that data. In addition, I'm very glad to hear that there was a conversation between economists and sociologists. That is only to be encouraged. And I think we can see that in the kinds of the way that you've done the study and the results. And I know these are not your final results. I think this is still work in progress. So keeping that in mind, that it is work in progress, I have a few points that I wanted to make, but to highlight some of the things that came up, which I think are worth mentioning again, is the sense of the self-made within the elite. And I'll come back to that, tying into one of your last points that you were making. The idea of wealth as a relational process is something I might want to come back to as well. And the importance of the spatial, the concentration in terms of the spatial. So just to start, to bring you back to the questions you set out to do in the beginning, one of the questions was about how do you see the social profile changing? And I mean, we get some sense of it, but I wondered if you could say a little more, particularly since you do mention how important caste remains, but we don't really get a sense of, like in terms of how much. I mean, because you have this category you call the fuzzy category. And I think if you could say a little more about the fuzzy category, because there seems to be a contradiction there, which is that you have this fuzzy category because you can't position these people within the big wealth or the medium wealth within the elite itself. So you have this fuzzy category. However, then you also mentioned that it could be caste So there might be a dimension of caste. So someone who is a Dalit entrepreneur with lower amounts than someone who's a non-Dalit. So what does that say about the persistence in terms of caste that you talk about? So just relating that a little more, and also maybe say a little about how did you decide? What is the criteria in which a Dalit qualifies to be within the elite vis-a-vis other categories, or should there be this kind of criteria? How does one actually do this with the data that's available? Also, if we could have more of a discussion potentially, I think maybe other questions will come up around the surveys that you did. And you show that you had about 290 interviews. How many of them were in the top wealth that you call the top wealth? And are those people really willing to talk about, you know, the kinds of processes they are involved in? I mean, I had so many, so I'm going to restrict myself. I thought there's something very interesting here when we think about economic historians like Gregory Clark, who've been using surname data to see whether there's a persistence of certain surnames within certain occupations. And he uses data from Bengal, etc., that there might be ways to also draw on that kind of data, potentially in the future, to expand the kind of work that you're doing. And then I think my last couple of points are really around the conclusions that you were making. I'm wondering whether there is some contradiction, a contradiction about the point Surinder was making about elites who, you said elite positions are rarely acquired through merit and competition, but how else do you make self-made? And then particularly since you are talking about Muslims or Dalits or other communities, how would they have the other resources needed to be self-made without merit and without competition and without, you know, that. And then finally, because you mentioned mobility kind of tangentially, I'm wondering whether through your work, we can say anything about how these processes, a self-made in one generation is potentially a scriptive for everybody that follows them later. Their next generations. I mean, essentially they are going to, especially when you're that wealthy. I mean, we're not here talking about the middle class where there's a fear or an anxiety of losing position. When you're so wealthy, the next generation. So in your data, is it possible to identify people who are first generation in that first timers in that list, vis-a-vis others who are second or third generation, and whether we can then sociologically start to build up and think about essentially the bigger theories of reproduction of inequalities, where, as you mentioned in the beginning, coming back to your beginning, this is rare in India, to look at the top part. When we think about reproduction of inequalities, we're really thinking of the bottom part. But overall, I think this is a really great beginning, and there's just so much more to talk about. But thank you. And should we now open for questions?
Thanks, Divya, for your discussion. I think we'll just let Surinder and Vamsi maybe, you know, engage with your few remarks and questions, and then we'll open discussion. The floor.
I'll quickly respond to the last point, and the rest I will leave for Vamsi to respond to. I think there's some kind of misunderstanding with self-made. Self-made is the claim made by the listers, right? We are contesting that claim that these self-made are actually from the cohort that already exists, which is mostly urban upper castes. They already come with those resources, both in terms of caste and community, but also, say, for example, Narayan Murthy or the other professionals. If you look at their names, even well-known names, 8 out of 10 would be the ones who already had certain kinds of cultural and caste community resources. And they, in some sense, were able to get into this system because they had those networks. And they may not be, in terms of actually quantitative wealth, anywhere near, but in otherwise, that's why it kind of becomes ascription process. So that is the argument we are making. There are individual case studies we can perhaps go to. And second point about survey, we actually did not do primary survey, which was impossible in the amount of time we had. If you want to take appointment with one billionaire, it can take you 3 months' time just to fix one interview. I mean, it's virtually impossible. What I was saying, that these were nominal surveys. in the sense that you identify, you list them, and then you identify some of them around which you could bring some data together from whatever sources you have available. There are few interviews that were possible, but in most cases that was not even aspired for. This was pandemic time. But at the same time, we told our researcher that here you have a schedule, at least around these variables. We don't have the schedule copy with us. We can share that schedule copy with you, that around these variables, try to find out. There are mostly about perception, sectors, and stuff like that. That was possible in some regions, but I think it kind of did not work as we wanted it to work. But there are case studies, but broadly speaking, this is what comes out of it.
I think Surinder answered most of the questions. Let me take one or two questions that he did not answer. This will take also a longer time to answer, so let me be brief in the interest of time. So when we talk about changes in social profile, we are also arguing that there is a consolidation of the old primarily, right? So there's a continuity, which is a dominant process, and elite expansion is where the changes in social profile occur. And if you take, let's say, a concrete case like the city of Hyderabad, until 40s, you actually see largely Muslim elites, and then you also see some zamindari, establishments across Telangana. Post 60s, 70s, you actually see communities from the agrarian, origins. The three deltas in Andhra, Penna River, Krishna River, Godavari River, you get Reddis, Kammas, and Rajus. So that's the change, and then they move to Hyderabad. So you actually see, and these are, socially different. I mean, they all belong to the so-called upper caste. But, these are, in Varna scheme, right? All three would fall into the so-called Shudra, category. But they were politically always dominant, freedom struggle, they were the political leaders, even though, Brahmins were also important in that region. So when they move to Hyderabad, the Muslim elite is already beheaded, in the sense of, they've left or they've been decimated, by the various processes that already occur in the city of Hyderabad. So they make an entry. But this is not the case with Bombay and Kolkata, for instance. There's not a very significant change in the social profile. Delhi, it's very different. That's what, we are still grappling with Delhi. I think it's the most complex and most interesting case. And it's not easy to get the representative sample for a city like Delhi. So I think that is an ongoing process, as Surinder also mentioned. Quickly, as Surinder already said, the 290 surveys were not primary surveys. They were the data that were collected from various sources. But we had a survey instrument. So people, the researchers filled that survey instrument using multiple sources and identified the sources. But we tried to do 10 case studies. And the case studies in some cases were primary interviews. In some cases, you would actually go meet with a journalist who is very knowledgeable, for instance, in Bombay. And then you, get a rich, textured account of a wealthy person or about a class of wealthy people or some temporal trends in Bombay. Those sorts of things, right? And Gregory Clark's, I have to look at it carefully, whether, we could potentially utilize it. But thanks for that suggestion. That's a potentially very useful thing to do. Yeah.
I mean, Shudra is a separate category. These are all rural upper castes or rural dominant castes. So they are not, Reddis are not Shudras. I mean, Reddis have always been landlords and upper castes in the rural context, like the Jats and Jats in Haryana and Punjab. We can say that they would claim to Shudra status because you want to superimpose a kind of Varna hierarchy, but they are all in their local context, the real upper castes. When it comes to the lower OBCs, as now they're officially classified, there are very few of them in this list.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Thank you for these different points. So
Okay, thank you. I have actually two questions. One is about the place of cities, but which cities? My question is, you mentioned that peri-urban spaces are now important, but before the contemporary period, do you see the concentration of the big wealth only in capital cities of states, or do smaller cities also play an important role in this history of, accumulation of wealth in the urban centers? And the second question is to Surinder. Could you elaborate about the point you briefly mentioned in the conclusion about the importance of issues of political representation, knowing what you know about the big wealth?
Yeah, you please do take a mic. If you don't mind, introduce yourself. I forgot to say yourself and ask a question. Thank you.
My name is Asif. I'm a researcher with Center for Policy Research. So my question is related to role of elites and the state. I mean, does state need elites from particular category across the temporal locations you have looked at, whether it's colonial state, whether it's current nation state, or it's a neoliberal state? And if it is the case, then that means elites and state are hand in glove, are partners. And so it means that policies and regulations that are framed by the state, so then it becomes kind of like those policies and regulations also become kind of ascriptive in a sense.
We'll ask you to, if you can answer these three questions, and then we'll start taking questions online.
Thank you. See, I think these two questions are related. So when we are talking about wealth elites, we have to simultaneously talk about state power. And that's what comes out from our study. That's what comes out from social science literature, that, big business has always historically had, once you have capitalism, capitalism is not something. So democracy and capitalism develop simultaneously globally. And there is a connection, class logic, which Marxists would talk about. We are slightly extending it and making it into wealth elite when we're talking about. So wealth elite obviously have access to state, and increasingly democratic political processes are in some sense also simultaneously money processes, wealth processes. Anyone who wants to contest elections, I mean, the amount of money they require just to kind of campaign for themselves, and then that kind of sets in dynamics. So I think the question of, when we look at wealth elite, we need to think about the kind of politics or the kind of effect it would have on democratic politics. That's why I put the word democracy in bracket with a question mark. So you can't think of democracies without thinking about economic processes. That's why this project is not simply talking about, wealth distribution as a descriptive process. When we say wealth distribution is also a relational process and political process, that also means that it would have implications. If the Muslim elite is kind of running away or shrinking or disappearing, that means Muslim voice is also disappearing or becoming kind of, or if the Dalit elite is not able to come up, that also would show up in kind of state processes. And it is in this context that question of representation becomes a moral and political question. That if among the wealthy, there are very few who come from these categories, either women or Dalits or Muslims or other minorities, this would have implications in the state processes, which we are already seeing. For example, ruling party can get away without giving a single seat to Muslims, which will constitute 15% of the Indian population. So would it be possible if Muslims were overrepresented in wealth elites? Perhaps not. I mean, I think in that consensus, it needs to be kind of seen also as a moral and political question of who. That's why question of ascription becomes very critical. If the wealth elite all belong to one particular small ethnic group, it would have implications for the kind of political systems you would have in future, even if it doesn't have at this moment. And therefore, those identities need to be, in some sense, explicitly stated and analyzed.
I'll respond to a couple of questions. First, I should go back to one of Divya's questions, which I didn't answer. The fuzzy category, right? That was created to get a wider net, of wealth accumulation processes and individuals, And we did that even if, you don't find, let's say, a Dalit, entrepreneur in the 100 to 1,000 crore category, seek them out. Because, you also get to understand what are the obstacles they're facing, or, seek women entrepreneurs out in order to see what kind of obstacles they face in, the wealth making process. So how is it different for a, an established, Parsi and Dalit, right, to participate in this process. So we created the fuzzy category deliberately to accommodate people who may not fit into the 1,000 plus or 100 plus, but people who are wealthy somewhat, but who are still going through that process. That is the rationale for the fuzzy category. I just wanted to. On the cities question, the spatial question, cities question, I think wealth processes were extremely diverse, in the pre-British period. So, for instance, Virji Vora is from Surat. Right, he's not from any of the. I mean, it was a very important, production and commercial center until 18th century, and now it's becoming a very important center again. It has become an important center again. Jagat Seth family was from Murshidabad, not Kolkata. So I think, so partly, Murshidabad was important politically as well. Or this the SETI that I talked about. So he is from Guntur. That was not a capital city either. I think it was, the processes that wealth creation processes were very diverse and dispersed, I think, in the pre-British period. And they moved to, the bigger metro centers during the British period. Of course, the major beneficiaries are Britishers primarily. They are the ones who accumulate a lot of wealth. But the Indian communities that join the wealth creation processes, they also start locating themselves in some of the urban centers. And that process is reversed to some extent between 1947 and 1980s. Because Indian public sector or a lot of processes are moved inward consciously. A city like Durgapur is created, right? I'm just giving you a random example. A lot of cities, towns or cities were created where wealth was created, during this period away from the metro centers. But what has happened in the last 30, 35 years is, wealth creation has really become concentrated, as Surinder said, in big cities, in cities, also big cities. And the top wealth is really from the top 6-7 cities in India. I think they locate themselves. And I think this is this goes back to the colonial period in a way. The similarities with that period, not the period right after independence or the pre-colonial period, which was more dispersed. I think this is what we gathered.
Just to add to this is something that came up in the earlier discussion in our presentation. Big wealth in India is increasingly all national. So the moment it becomes big, it's no longer localized. It would invariably operate from multiple sites, and metropolitan cities become its home, right? And it need not be one site. So even though there are regional stories, but once it becomes big wealth, it automatically also becomes perhaps global, not only national. It's operating now globally in the global market, not only in India, in some way or the other, in terms of its exchange, in terms of kind of import export. So they're not localized any longer. So that is also kind of critical.
Thank you. So I think we'll start taking questions online. Yeah. Please, can you come and speak on the mic? It's because we have an online audience. It's okay.
So my question was on the slide where you show the increasing inequality in the urban spaces and decreasing in the rural. So to what extent does that account for migration from rural to urban spaces? Like, for example, I am from Orissa, but in my community of Bania community, I've heard stories of many people migrating from villages in Haryana and Rajasthan to Orissa in search of better occupation and opportunities, and they've in turn become the wealthiest of those cities. So to what extent have you accounted for that, or is that a potential to be researched on? Thank you.
Thank you for your talk and presentation. Now, my question is about to study wealth as a relational process, and what I think about that. And I wanted to just to ask the weight of the family, because it is not only individual, it is family. And when the family is large, when the family is wide, they never face the crisis because they are able to get some capital, cultural capital, political capital, economical capital. And at the time, for instance, where it is absolutely mandatory to get degree graduation, a part of the French bourgeoisie has declined, but another part because they were close to the state. And so for me, it is the meaning of relational process. I mean, how they will start maybe with economical capital, but they will add maybe cultural, scholar, social, and try to reproduce in different way. So just it is not a question, just observation.
Very quickly, I think then what Raja can come, Vamsi can come in. Migration is very, very important because if you look at the trajectories of wealthy in Eastern India, that's why regions become very critical. Most of them are Marwadis. And Marwadis, again, from Marwad region of Rajasthan, or even in Delhi, many of them are Baniyas from Haryana, from other parts of the country, but they all would be from traditionally what we'd call as urban upper caste. Many of them have rural origins. When I was doing my study in 1980s, Baniyas were leaving villages because local dominant castes had become very powerful. They come to small towns nearby and then they move on to Delhi, they go to Calcutta. Jagan Seth also, actually, Jagat Seth, originally is a Marwadi. So this is not something which is happening only in the 21st century. It starts in 14th, 15th century. So there was a kind of trading community network which was operating across South Asia, and that's how they become very rich. So I think when we are talking about migration of these communities, this is not the migration of security guards. This is not the distressed migration from Bihar. This is a different kind of migration where they are already networked and they are looking for opportunities, and they are in some sense monopolizing. The entire wealthy elite of Eastern India is outsider. From Bihar to Bengal to perhaps also Odisha and largely Northeast, they would all be from kind of, Western India. And these are very important processes. And my second question is linked to it, because wealth has not been seen as a sociological question. So we either think of wealth in moral terms, that wealth is crime, and leave it there. And then, or in very broad class terms, that there is homogeneity of bourgeoisie or, kind of, mobilities, and we leave it there. But precisely, if we have to look at, that was the reason why we are repeating again and again that we need to look at it as a relational process. We need to do these kinds of empirical studies. This is just a starting. I think 70% of our work is just question of, around framing questions and, how do we identify the questions? How do we identify possibilities? And I think this is precisely, these are the kind of questions that we need to ask. Narayan Murthy, for example, is a very good example. Or, Marwadis in Bengal, any individual case studies, that's where the fuzzy category becomes very critical, that how do you pick up those individuals and then do case studies. Each individual requires 2 months of field work. So this was not possible, but this is what we are trying to, in some sense, suggest for a project called wealth studies, if it has to be wealth studies, we need to raise these kinds of questions. What would be the trajectories of Baniyas or Marwadis when they become wealthy? Very different from when Reddis and Kammas become wealthy. And we would not really, unless we recognize ethnicity or ascription as criteria, we would not be able to identify the subtle differences. Or when Punjabis and Sikhs become wealthy, their way of being wealthy would be very different. And I think those are also interesting processes that we need to kind of account for and stuff like that.
So on the migration question, I think just to add to what Surinder said, there are three kinds of migration which are important in studying processes like this. One is, what Surinder already alluded to, which is, these traditional business communities, that not only, were migrating across the country, from, Marwar region to Kolkata, let's say, or Hyderabad in the 18th, 19th century. So that was already happening. Post-independence, you also see another process, which is the agrarian rich. After they acquire a certain, level of surplus, that's a rural-urban kind of migration. They begin to come into urban spaces. And then, the third migration is not that of top wealth, but, the poor. See, you were asking the question of, why the extreme deprivation. So these are, either, transitory migrants, people who come for part of the year, or even permanent migrants. So that is the extreme poor of villages, migrating to cities. So that's urbanization of inequity and urbanization of, the wealthy. Right? And some of them in the urbanization of the wealthy, some of them join the top. So just to sort of answer you, yeah.
I think we'll just quickly read a few questions or a few comments online. So the first one ends with the question: in the post-colonial and neoliberal period, Suraj Sethi is asking how these relations have transformed. I think the ones, between the feudal lords that were amongst, the wealthiest at the time, and their serf or their, mazdoor, their mazdoor, their workers, whoever would that particularly be. So do you want to answer that? Do you want to read more first? Okay, please go ahead.
The same point that, we need a lot more empirical work. And I think instead of thinking of India as one cultural, historical, economic region, we need to localize, particularly if we have to go to pre-colonial period. What is happening in Hyderabad is very, very different from what is happening in Gujarat. What is happening in Gujarat, again, within Gujarat also, you would have different trajectories in the kind of desert region and in South Gujarat, Surat region. And these are kind of, we have this tendency to kind of work through the national kind of past as if there was one singular process unfolding in this South Asian region or in India, or there was something called India. So I think we need to get out of that. And then we need to kind of go into local histories of wealth. And there we need to look at not just the wealth, but relational processes. That's what we are trying to say. So, I mean, your question is very relevant, but it needs to be empirically framed in a context. And that context would vary significantly from region to region. And I think there were very significantly different regional processes of class formation, which kind of, in some sense, also articulated with existing ethnic and religious and community and caste formations. And that is just the starting point. And then how did it work out? I think it kind of, again, changed from time to time with migrations, with people coming from outside, with ecological processes kind of unfolding in different ways.
I'll read some next questions. So that's a remark from Kiran. A question just below from another guest. Thank you for such a fascinating presentation. So just curious to know if there is any role of corruption, bribery in making or retaining wealth. Are there any patterns that the work hints at? If you could answer that, Vamsi. Does corruption play any role in making or retaining wealth?
Absolutely, but we cannot glean that from the surveys we did. From secondary sources, we could think of connecting processes of corruption, and the very fact that a lot of this information was also collected from Panama Papers, right? That is evidence of, illegal stashing away of wealth. And I think there are several such instances, of how, illegitimately wealth is, even if wealth is accumulated legitimately, after it crosses a certain bound, you don't want to pay tax. You don't want to basically reveal all that wealth. So you stash it away in various illegitimate ways. So there's no question about it. Corruption is super important in all of this.
Thanks, Fiance. I think I'll just pick the last one that that you should or you could answer from Hillary. That's quite a mouthful. Can you address any global aspects of the super elite? Do they move, hold, and earn wealth abroad? Can they evade taxes and nosy social? Preserve wealth in this way? Do elite family ties extend beyond India's borders? And I think we'll try to end, if you can, on that note, because we're a bit already over time. And thank.
I think let me make two quick points, and Surinder can answer this. This is absolutely true, and this is also the difficult part. One of the challenges of doing this project. There are clearly these elites have expanded globally. For instance, several of these families have investments in Africa or Latin America or other parts of Asia, and also Europe and US. Some of the developed parts of the world. But studying those processes carefully and looking at their global expansion is not easy. That's the first point. The second point is this is not new. If you go back to 19th century, the wealthy in India were connected globally, or 18th century. The Chettiar community was connected to the entire Bay of Bengal littoral. They were extended to Thailand, the Malay region, apart from South India, right? I mean, the Bay of Bengal, Myanmar, that entire region, they were connected. The Marwadis and the Banyas, they were connected to global trading links through, the city of Hyderabad in Pakistan. That was a major trading center. So, they had very significant establishments there that connected with the, West Asian region or the Middle Eastern region. So that is definitely a part of, any phase of, economic expansion that is globalizing in nature, right? So these elites also connect with the global processes, but studying the global part is not that easy. That is one of the challenges. In fact, we talked about it this morning when we were thinking about the challenges. Surinder and I discussed precisely this point. There are linkages, but how do we carefully get at these linkages?
Out of syllabus. This was not part of the study. Sorry, thank you. I think that's what I also know. This is from journalistic accounts. We all know this. But yeah, we didn't study this, to be honest. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your presence. Thank you online for being with us. Just as a reminder, the new season of seminars will start on the 4th of September with Ashish Kotari. Thank you.